The pandemic has required us to take the next loss, learn from that, put meaning to it, hopefully, but then something else happens, and something else happens to that. And so no wonder Americans are feeling like a roller coaster.
According to a recent survey by the American Psychological Association, 82% said they never imagined the COVID-19 pandemic would last this long. In addition, Americans are hesitant about the future regardless of their vaccination status. 49% said they feel uneasy about adjusting to in-person interaction once the pandemic ends. As we try to move forward, a Kansas State University associate professor in the College of Health and Human Sciences says that many Americans need to go through the sixth stage of grief, having a meaning assigned to it. On today's Sound Living, what we have learned from dealing with COVID-19 stress. Sound Living is a weekly public affairs program produced by Research and Extension at Kansas State University. I'm Jeff Wichman. Elaine Johannes, who is also a youth development specialist for K-State Research and Extension, says 67% of the respondents said that living through the coronavirus pandemic has been a roller coaster of emotions. Elaine, I don't think either one of us thought it would be more than a year before we were able to do a face-to-face interview and not have to use Zoom or the telephone. We're finally to that point, but as part of that, we're also learning how to get back into the normal routine. But before we talk about that, because we really want to focus on that more in our second segment next week, what we're looking at right now is the fact that we need to learn from what has happened. And are we learning? Have we learned?
Mm-hmm. Jeff, first off, I want to say, yes, it's so nice to be with you and being able to have a talk and visit face-to-face. We are still aware that the pandemic is still going on, but fortunately, I do believe we've taken a turn with the vaccine. So thank you. It is amazing, isn't it, that it's been more than a year. Actually, you and I met last year in May. We had a discussion about the resilience that can be built as we were just kind of thinking about this is a long haul. We were thinking about what are we learning to kind of acclimate to the new way of doing our work and being able to relate through Zoom and other things. So, yeah, it's been a year. The American Psychological Association actually recognized that in their report that they just released last month in March. And that report was around what have we learned from dealing with the coronavirus stress. And according to that national report, the majority of Americans did not realize this would be this long either. 82% of the respondents were surprised that it would be over a year. I think most of us thought we would get in there, take care, everybody would adhere to what public health protocols would be, and we'd be good to go. But that wasn't the case.
Yeah, there was a huge difference between 2 weeks and 12 months, 14 months.
Yeah, and it's still going on, with the different variants and things. So what are we learning? Again, from that report, 67% of the respondents from a national sample said that they too have had a roller coaster of emotions throughout this whole time period, which is really hard for us as a species to deal with. Usually we kind of can acclimate to a sudden trauma, a sudden grief, a loss. And then with our friends and how we kind of rebound, we can move on. What's also interesting is that out of those who did use Zoom or were able to interact through technological means, 84% said actually using tech helped them cope. It wasn't that much of a burden. Of course, these are adults. I'm sure if we would ask younger people who missed out on being with their friends in sports or classes or faith groups or even 4-H clubs, they may have a different response. But for adults who did use Zoom or were able to stay engaged through technological means, 84% said that they benefited from that. But again, the majority of the respondents said that there was stress, that it lasted longer than what they had ever expected. And 46% are not comfortable by going back to the way their lives were. And I always feel uncomfortable right now hearing the word, let's go back to the way it was. Jeff, I think you and I and the people listening know that we will not go back. It's different.
And when we talk about, let's maybe look at the emotions of it. When they were talking about feeling different emotions and things like that, what happens when we go through that emotional process?
Usually there's a staging per se. It's not straight line from one stage to the next. But when we think about an unusual, unexpected stressor that has an element of loss and risk to it, usually we have the first stage of shock, and then after that shock, then we try to deny what's happening. After denial usually comes a period of just sadness and grief where the loss becomes palpable. That time can be difficult, especially if we don't acknowledge our losses, if we don't talk about it. But then moving beyond that, it once was thought that we accept the loss. But some of the research around grief and change and how we feel about that has added on another perspective, and that's the sixth stage of grief. Some of David Kessler's work around we have to have a meaning assigned to it. And I think that's probably where our emotions are right now as you and I visiting today and maybe the people listening in. What's the point? What's the meaning that we can take away from this, even though it's still going on? So some of the early work in grief and loss, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and David Kessler actually was one of her students. We learned from that early work that grief and loss does not go in a straight line. Even though I just gave those stages, we bounce back and forth. And the pandemic has required us to take the next loss, learn from that, put meaning to it, hopefully, but then something else happens, and something else happens to that. And so no wonder Americans are feeling like a roller coaster. No wonder Americans, from the American Psychological Association report, says, this is so long, what's going on? Well, it's just bouncing back and forth.
We've also had a wide range of losses, haven't we? Because there's the work relationships, there's the personal relationships, not being able to always be with a loved one. We've lost what some people would just describe as freedoms, the opportunity to move around. So is that part of that bouncing back and almost having to readjust on the fly?
Yes, yeah. Readjust and also recall the way we were back then. You know, we aren't the only society that's been through this. When we look at history, I've been trying to read up to figure out, okay, what happened in the Spanish flu, the 1918 to 1920, 21, and 22 Spanish flu, the pandemic then. And actually, in reading some of the historical material, there's not a lot of material about how did we do with our mental health. Of course, back then, we didn't have social media. We didn't have Facebook. We didn't have the 24-hour news. And so how can we take a glimpse of what we learned from that experience? And how did people cope? Well, some of the literature actually comes from a book. Some of the material that was crafted or kept by Alfred Cones in his 1967 book. And then some of the historians have taken that book and then actually found out a little bit more from maybe early press. But evidently, from the 1918 pandemic, there were some mental health issues. There were some mental health issues because of the sudden deaths that happened. Evidently, that flu, which was, they believe now, a derivative of H1N1, took people really suddenly. And so you had sudden deaths. Both parents who would die, and the children were left. At one report, 31,000 kids in New York itself had either one or both their parents gone. So when we think about that suddenness and not really knowing, what's a cure or was there, and it lingered on like this is lingering on. The mental health issues were great. Being depressed, being unsure, There was some need to explain why and to find a reason for. And so we do know that there were some political unrest and some concern then too. So it's not unusual that right now the pandemic we're going through and we're seeing a turn now, that we're unsettled. And evidently from the 1918 pandemic that suicide rates went up too, but they weren't obvious right at that first year. They lingered on. The ripple effects were years beyond. And so, Jeff, I do think we need to be ready to reacclimate, to redefine what our recovery is, and to reflect on what have we gained from it. What have we learned? And we can't go back because we'll never be the same again.
And to be clear, when we're talking about this report, we're talking about citizens in general. We're not talking about someone who maybe had a mental health issue prior to the pandemic.
Yes, correct. These are adults in the United States, recently completed some questionnaires that the American Psychological Association gave, some interviews, and these are just citizens who have experienced it. For the long term and redefining, I think, what is mental health, especially during this difficult time. It's unsettling. I think about a quote that resonates with me, and maybe it will with you. The quote came from Truman, Harry S., and President Truman said, "The reward of suffering is experience." And that, to me, kind of gives me an understanding that the suffering is real, the loss is real, the sadness, authentic. So what can we gain from it? Well, we can say we're wiser, and we have had this experience. And so telling of stories, sharing where we were when we got the order that we can't go back to work, where we were when we bought our first mask. Did we give them as gifts, Christmas gifts? I know we did. Reflecting back on the experience because the suffering was so great.
I'm thinking that there's going to be some very interesting Facebook timelines that pop up in 5 years when they post those anniversaries and we start seeing all of the comments we made, all the pictures that we posted and that sort of thing. And that is maybe helpful to have that documented. I know a lot of people keep journals and they write things down, and talking about it, the communication aspect, is probably at least one thing we can do that is helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And you know what? I would hope that generations look at us, look at our stories, look at our Facebook posts, look at the pictures we took, and they reflect back, because we don't have those from the 1918 flu epidemic. We seem, or maybe they themselves didn't take time to reflect because they had so much on their plates back then. The next thing was the Depression, and then going into World War II right after that. So we need to, I think, take reflection and tell our stories, post what we know to be true for our experiences, and to understand that suffering did teach us, and we do have experience to share.
What was the one big thing that jumped out at you from the APA report?
How much we're alike. We are a true community. Americans, no matter where we were, we realized that this was a tough thing to go through. We felt this roller coaster up and down, not sure. Maybe we felt alone, but we were still, as a group, a community. So I walk away reading that report going, yeah, that's pretty much accurate, right? For a full year, we weren't expecting this. We were slammed back and forth. But, we came out of it and are coming out of it as a community.
That's Kansas State University Associate Professor in the College of Health and Human Sciences, Elaine Johannes. On next week's Sound Living, Elaine focuses on the re-entry and recovery process of the pandemic. Sound Living is a weekly public affairs program produced by Research and Extension at Kansas State University. I'm Jeff Wichman, and this is the K-State Radio Network.